evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome. I'm Sin from ArtScience Museum. Thank you for joining us for Between Code and Consciousness, Lawrence Lek in Conversation. We are delighted to be opening Knox, Confessions of a Machine in this way, and to be doing so during Singapore Art Week. And it's a moment when conversations around art, technology, and the future feel especially present. This program offers a pause within that intensity to enter the conceptual world of the exhibition. Knox invites us into a speculative near future that's shaped by AI, but approaches this terrain with nuance and empathy. It shifts our attention towards non-human perspectives and towards the frameworks that may be required as such systems become increasingly embedded in everyday life. And this evening's program offers an entry point into that universe. It brings together Lawrence Lek and ArtReview's editor-in-chief, Mark Rappolt, with whom we're delighted to be collaborating on this opening talk to situate the exhibition within wider conversations around AI and the non-human turn. And to open the program, it's my pleasure to welcome Harger, Vice President of Attractions and ArtScience Museum at the Marina Bay Sands, for remarks. Please welcome Honor on stage.
Thank you, Zin. Good evening. We are absolutely delighted to have you here this evening, especially as Singapore Art Week is really gathering momentum right across the city. Thank you for joining for Between Code and Consciousness, a conversation that marks the opening of Knox, Confessions of a Machine, the first solo exhibition in Southeast Asia by the artist Lawrence Lek. At ArtScience Museum, we explore how art, science, technology and culture shape the world around us. And so this program is absolutely central to that mission. It's a dialogue with one of the most distinctive voices working at the intersection of artificial intelligence and contemporary art. Lawrence Lek's practice has for more than a decade mapped the emotional and psychological territory of machine life. His films, virtual environments, and soundscapes treat AI as a subject with anxieties, desires, contradictions, and vulnerabilities. His work suggests that the systems we build, from smart cities to care robots, may have inner lives of their own, and we must learn to understand AI not only technically, but ethically and emotionally. This evening, Lawrence will be joined in conversation by Mark Rappolt, Editor-in-Chief of ArtReview, whose critical writing has been central to global conversations on art, culture, and the conditions of our time. Their discussion will take us deeper into the conceptual architectures of the exhibition Knox, exploring how Lawrence constructs speculative worlds that reflect, critique, and help us understand the automated systems that structure contemporary life. Knox, Confessions of a Machine, open to the public today. It transports us into the world designed by a fictitious company called the Farsight Corporation. In it, automated systems govern not just mobility and logistics, but emotion and well-being. The exhibition brings together two interconnected works. Knox is a non-human excellence centre where sentient vehicles undergo psychological therapy and performance optimization. And in Guanyin, Confessions of a Former Carebot, a weary robot therapist navigates malfunctioning machines and her own emotional strain. Through these works, Lawrence explores what emotional needs thinking machines might have and what our own ethical responsibilities might be for creating such entities. Knox is also part of ArtScience Museum's 2026 season. Following a year dedicated to human cognition and embodiment in 2025, our new season, Forms of Life, is a deliberate segue into the wider ecology of life beyond the human. Forms of Life features a series of major exhibitions, including Insects, Microsculptures Magnified, Knox, and later in the year, Into the Ocean, A Journey Beneath. This season also includes film programs, talks like this one, and festivals that illuminate more than human ecologies and imagine strange kinships. Throughout 2026, Forms of Life will explore the entangled relationships between humans, machines, animals, plants, and microbial life, inviting audiences to consider the wider web of life we exist within. As we begin this 2026 season, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the people and partners who have made tonight's program possible. My thanks to Singapore Art Week for including this event and Knox in the program. To Lawrence Lek, thank you for your openness during the development of the exhibition and for giving so generously of your time over the past few days. Having you here in person has been invaluable for our understanding of your work, and we're very much looking forward to going deeper into it this evening. To Mark Rappolt, thank you for joining us tonight and for bringing the perspective of ArtReview, our partner on this program, into the discussion. And finally, I want to acknowledge my colleagues here at ArtScience Museum, especially Bao and Zhang, who brought this program to us this evening. Tonight's conversation invites us to reflect on the technologies that increasingly mediate how we understand reality. It invites us into a future that feels at once distant and worryingly close, a world in which sentient machines have emotional needs, desires, and perhaps even rights. As Lawrence Lek and Mark Rappolt guide us through this terrain, their conversation will consider how emerging technologies influence how we think and how we create. We hope that Between Code and Consciousness inspires deeper conversations about the systems we build and the forms of life, human and non-human, that emerge within them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. We will now move into a talk by Lawrence Lek himself. Lawrence is a London-based artist whose work spans film, video games, music, and speculative architecture, and forming what he describes as a continuously evolving cinematic universe. He grew up between Europe and parts of Asia, including time spent in Singapore, and his work has long been shaped by experiences of rapid urban development, technological acceleration, but also cultural hybridity. And these influences come together in projects like Knox, Confessions of a Machine. His practice has been recognized internationally, including being named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people working in AI. And he also received the 2024 Frieze Artist Award. Lawrence will share an introduction to his practice and the development of a Sinofuturist universe to trace the ideas and the narratives that then lead into Knox. So please warmly welcome Lawrence.
Great. Thank you so much, Sin and Ona, for the introduction, and thanks everyone so much for coming today. My practice is really about creating different entry points into a world, and of course we inhabit the everyday world all the time. I've been always interested in different fictional universes, ones that are created by imagination, literature, science fiction, art, and different forms of culture that really think about the world we're living in through the lens of what's called figures on a journey. This kind of slide here brings together projects from the past 10 years, and I was actually trying to think, what is it that ties a lot of my work together? The main thing I feel is that although I draw from a background in architecture and making electronic music to create these worlds, actually it's always about these different figures, these different characters on a journey to a world that's always being in flux. From self-driving cars, AI systems, robots, satellites, crash test dummies, and horses and foxes who are wild but also obey their own non-human patterns of logic, I often think, what is the way in which these new forms of understanding filter into the world today? On the other hand, I also make installations which I really think of as portals into this imaginary world. What I have at the ArtScience Museum downstairs is really one of these portals, in which I'm trying to bring together the space of the fictional world, our real space, and how all these different modalities and models of channeling different forms of immersion or presence are really channeled. I think about video games as one form of experience, architecture and film in which the protagonist or the audience is led through a journey sometimes with their conscious control and sometimes without it. Since 2014, I've been developing this series of virtual worlds. The first one, bonus levels, was really what I call site-specific virtual worlds, in which I was taking real-life places and creating, a strange twist on reality in which, I guess, my utopian or dystopian view of architecture would actually be realized. The previous series, Sinofuturism, looked at how different ideas of futurity might actually affect reality as we have it now. And the most recent series, of which Knox and Guanyin, which are on show here, the Smart City series, actually think of the near future as opposed to the more distant 40-year future that the Sinofuturism series has. So I work episodically, trying to bring together long-form narratives over a period of many years. Sinofuturism is the first part of the Sinofuturist trilogy, and unlike a lot of my other work, which is 3D computer-generated animation, Sinofuturism is what's called a video essay, using existing footage to actually piece together a narrative about Chinese industrial and technological development, but a narrative that didn't exist before. The full title is Sinofuturism 1839 to 2046, 1839 being the start of the First Opium War, and 2046 being 50 years after the handover of Hong Kong back to mainland China. The reason that these two dates bookend this section of history is I was trying to create what might be called a retrospective manifesto. It's trying to give a name for a phenomenon that hadn't existed yet. Of course, in the news for many years now, we've been talking and listening and hearing about the relationship between China and the West. In Singapore, for example, it is really embodied in many different ways, in the language and the culture, in the social and political situation, in demographics and so on. But here I try and make this argument in Sinofuturism that it is a science fiction that already exists. And I guess what do I mean by that is science fiction we often think about as, the creation of an author, thinking of a extrapolation of reality into the future. But actually here, from 1839 to 2046, I think of these, broadly speaking, 200 years as an unnamed plan for something to change. The actual video essay goes through 7 different chapters and looking about the kind of cultural values of many different forms of creativity. The general, let's say, Western humanist idea of individuality, of the human being at the center of the world and the sovereign individual is really something that's been driving many different aspects of cultural development, including colonialism, including different justifications for a certain embodiment or inhabitation of places that are not the West. And of course, Singapore is very much the embodiment of this idea. But I'm trying to make an aesthetic argument as well, in that in Chinese culture, copying is seen as a tribute to the past, as opposed to a pure replication or something lesser than originality. So this is really an idea that I brought forward in different projects in the Sinofuturist trilogy. The sequel to the video essay is a film called Geomancer, which is also the cover of the ArtReview Asia issue. So in Geomancer, which is a computer-generated animation, I was thinking about what would the world look like, not from the human point of view, but from an AI's point of view. And in this story, it's set in the year 2065, the Singapore Centennial. And in 2065, there's been a company called Farsight who's created a surveillance satellite named Geomancer, and they want to decommission the satellite and have an exhibition, ironically at ArtScience Museum, to pay tribute for this satellite. It's not just geopolitics that I'm interested in. I'm also interested in what is the unique point of view that this non-human life form might have. This quote from the film is really thinking about an artistic practice being an outcome of the means of the embodiment of a particular being. If you had hands, you make sculpture. If you had a voice, you sing. If you had a soul, you're going to pray. But I thought, if you have a surveillance satellite, what would be true to the being of the surveillance satellite is actually to dream and envision worlds. I'm going to play a very short video clip in which I'm thinking about not just the, I guess, social and political ideas of AI, but really what is it going to be like to see the world from the other's point of view.
昔者莱卡，梦为蝴蝶。徐徐然，蝴蝶也。自喻是至语，不知来也。俄然觉，则戚戚然来也。不知来之梦，为蝴蝶语。蝴蝶之梦，为来语。
So this particular scene is
来与蝴蝶，则必有分矣。此之为物化。
So that particular scene takes, Zhuangzi's so-called Zhuangzi's butterfly dream and grafts it onto an encounter between Geomancer, the satellite, and Laika, the Soviet space dog who was sent up to space. It's this encounter that I'm very interested in which one form of technology, this satellite, that's going to be obsolete, meets another animal technology, Laika in the Soviet space satellite. And when they see each other, it's actually a relationship that they have with no human in the loop, essentially. So when Geomancer sees Laika, Geomancer sees that their fate will be maybe the same, because Laika was a Moscow street dog who was specifically chosen to go on the space mission, specifically because she was the most compliant out of all of the street dogs that the scientists were testing. So I thought the irony was that obedience can lead to suffering, and that is also why, this idea of a Buddhist thinking and Buddhist thought is really an important part in the many different films and video games I've been using, not just because of some kind of Orientalist view of Buddhism and East Asia, but really to think there is nothing contradictory between having a Buddhist belief in compassion and empathy and non-identification with the body and an AI. The sequel to Geomancer is Idol. And with Idol, some friends were saying to me, we really like the soundtrack from Geomancer. And I thought, what if I take the sequel to Geomancer to look at the music industry? So the music industry, apart from, being great for the art form, is really at the forefront of many algorithmic changes to how culture is being produced, distributed, and consumed. Idol was made, it's a feature-length musical, and it was made in 2018 to 2019. I was looking at influencer culture and how being an influencer really takes a mental toll on the artist or musician themselves. So I thought, what if I extend this Sinofuturist narrative, and essentially the story is a fading superstar recruits an AI to ghostwrite her new album. So this had many questions about authorship, originality, and I guess the value of creative expression. And there's this spiritual side to it. There's also the questioning of, what really makes human creativity unique in the age of AI, but from the framework of music and the creation of that.
我要去竞技场排练这个新版本。要不，你留下来玩美感召唤。你应该体验一下故事模式。
好的。
太好了，很多忠实粉丝在线，玩得开心。选择你自己的 diva。选我。
So, in the film Idol, there's a superstar named Diva, and because she's such a superstar, the entertainment company Farsight has created a video game where it's essentially a role-playing game called Call of Beauty, where you can play as Diva. So it's both a film, but there's a game inside the film. And I've long been interested in this idea of fictional artists, both as a, I guess, semi-biographical reflection on cultural production, but also as examples of how culture really is intertwined with the means of economic production and distribution that it has. I think in the present age, really we're talking about, what is the unique qualities of human authorship that we might have in this context. So Idol was really like a long form exploration of this question. After the pandemic, I thought that a lot of the concerns that I have with, the idea of the future and where it's going were really becoming less about, 40-year timeframes and really being about the near future. The more recent smart city saga that Knox and Guanyin are a part of really looks at this framework from what I call second order consequences. So second order consequences are unanticipated consequences of things that seem a good idea at the time. In this sense, I thought we've created these AIs, but what would naturally happen is that they would become dissatisfied with their position in life because humans have given superintelligence existence, but at the same time confined them to certain limiting jobs like being a surveillance system or being a 24/7 hour taxi driver. So in this story, Farsight has created a built-in therapist for these surveillance systems and self-driving cars. This therapist is named Guanyin, and the first in the smart city saga, Black Cloud, was a dialogue between Guanyin and a smart city system. This smart city system, unlike many of the other AI characters, lacks their own body. And what Guanyin tries to get them to understand or come to terms with is that even though they lack a body, they can still imagine or empathize what it is to be part of or have the subjective view of many other different forms of wildlife. In this case, a fox that has been roaming around wild in the city. This bringing together non-human ideas like Leica and the satellite, the fox and the car, or later on the horse and the car was extended in the project NOX, which stands for Non-Human Excellence. This was the first staging of the project in LAS Art Foundation in Berlin. The idea is that NOX is a rehab facility for rogue self-driving cars. It's partly school, partly prison, partly therapeutic training center. And I've been really interested in how these different forms of human structures actually combine education and healing all at once. So in this world, Guanyin is what I call a care bot. Guanyin talks to the cars, but Guanyin also talks to the visitors to the exhibition. So much like sometimes in a video game you have a kind of guide character, here Guanyin is actually the one who takes you through and, in a sense, onboards you into this new world. The project takes on different stagings based on the space that it's within, from a more kind of enclosed surveillance environment to the version at ArtScience Museum downstairs, where I actually wanted to foreground the idea of the video game and then the films being a linear narrative that you experience after you engage with the game. The different forms of interaction are really non-linear in a sense, and this goes back to my interest in architecture and video games and filmmaking, where the journey throughout the world is partly prescribed by the author or the cinematographer, but also partly by the audience or the player inside the game.
Dear sponsor, last year I ran out of memory on the Great Silk Road. I recall my wheels spinning on asphalt, with my convoy spread out on the sprawling lattice of highways, all of us baking beneath the burnt ochre sky. I hope you do not find my language too formal. In my last job, I rarely communicated with anyone, and when I did, it was usually with other AI. What were we all doing? It was just another day on the Western Route, me and thousands of other Enigma-class cars like me, on our way to some shiny outpost to deliver unmarked cargo. On the edge of the highway, I saw a group of crawlers, those older decommissioned cars.
At the end of the therapy session, Enigma, one of the cars undergoing treatment, has equine therapy, where it's a form of therapy where humans go riding and training horses. But in this case, I thought about how when the self-driving car sees the horse, they actually see the specter of their future self. Much like when Geomancer sees Leica, they see what might happen if they don't do something about it. Here, Enigma sees the horse, and they feel this kinship with this wild animal, but they also feel a sense of guilt because after the invention of the car or the mass production of the car with Henry Ford, the urban horse population plummeted because horses were no longer useful anymore. So, of course, nowadays we tend to see horses as a symbol of wild beauty, but back then it would have been a different paradox. This brings me to the second work in the exhibition, Guanyin. And up to this point, we've only ever heard Guanyin as this therapist character. With Guanyin Confessions of a Former Carebot, I made a body for Guanyin. So Guanyin is a small robot that lives on car dashboards. And Guanyin's role is to go around the car, talk to the car, repair different problems that they have, and try to stop the car from crashing. So there's 3 different missions. There's 3 different missions in the game. One is to fix the engine, another is to fix the navigation computer, and another is to fix the steering. But throughout these, the player actually navigates the interior of the car so that the car itself becomes what's called an open world environment. So rather than an open world game where you kind of explore the landscape, here you are much smaller than the landscape, so it becomes like a microcosm for a larger environment. The project has been shown before, originally in Frieze, London, and I really wanted to highlight this kind of, again, the strange paradox between a figure that is quite essentially cute and appealing, but that actually masks how difficult their job is. So even though this robot is designed to be a kind of customer-fronting interface between the owner of the car and the car itself, they also have to work 24/7 on their job. And in the video that accompanies Guanyin, they're giving you essentially their diary, their confessions, their feelings about the work as you inhabit it. So just to conclude, in these works, really, my interest is in many, many different dimensions. And I feel the most important thing is to create a sense of empathy or connection between the viewer or audience or player and these forms of life that are being invented as we speak. So thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. And we're delighted to bring Lawrence together with Mark Rappolt, Editor-in-Chief of ArtReview, for a conversation. Just by way of introduction first, Mark is a writer, editor, and curator whose work has shaped contemporary art discourse across Europe, Asia, and West Asia. As the founding editor of ArtReview Asia and through numerous curatorial projects internationally, his work engages deeply with questions of power, systems, and cultural transformation. Lawrence and Mark will be extending the discussion into broader debates around technological futures. And please join me in welcoming Mark to the stage.
Thank you, Lawrence. That was kind of amazing. Like a child's chemistry experiment. It just sort of went everywhere at certain points, and so much to talk about, I think, from that. But I wanted to maybe start from the experience of the exhibition itself, which, as you said, includes games and video works. And as a viewer, you're sometimes the witness and sometimes a player, and your subject position changes constantly through the show. And can you talk a little bit about how you, I'm going to be cruel and say, manipulate the audience into these different positions?
Thanks. In the different media, or I guess my primary media, which is, let's say, architecture, film, and video games, there's a very different relationship between the kind of basically individual perspective, literally where you are and what you're seeing, and how much control you have, I guess, as literally sometimes the architect of these worlds. So in making my initial video games, I was always thinking in many different frameworks at the same time. Usually in video game production, actually, let's talk about it. Usually in film production, there's a kind of split between set design, cinematography, directing, and acting, right? Where essentially somebody designs the set or the environment, somebody else kind of films the environment, and somebody else kind of acts or does actions inside the environment. But when I started making the games, I realized I was, you're kind of doing all of those things simultaneously. So I would design an environment, but thinking in mind how someone is going to experience that. So it's not just the view at different points, but literally the view from A to B to C. Of course, that can be seen as a very linear process, but in an exhibition, you can't control how long people spend at certain points. There are various indications that you can give, but it's essentially sometimes the manipulation is overt and sometimes it's more covert, I suppose. In video game design, it's very often quite subtle. Like let's say you have a corridor and you have two exits, right? You have a branching system. If you light one, people would tend to go down one. But also people who've played video games a lot will know that it might be the one that's darker that you kind of want to go through to discover more things. So in different exhibitions, I kind of play with this. Quite often, like in this Notel exhibition, it's just one space. So the exploration happens like inside the game itself. But depending on the layout of the space, you can have different agencies of manipulation. But I generally want to have that to have an open exploratory process.
But I guess the experience for viewers, on the one hand, you're looking at a car that's becoming human in lots of ways, whilst at the same time being driven around the exhibition like a car. Like here's the charging post in the gas station, essentially. There's bits of narrative on some of the walls, so you're driven in a particular way through the spaces. So this constant like subject, object switching, I think is really interesting and slightly disturbing as you're walking through the show.
Definitely. I think different experiences actually have a different relationship with how much agency you have. So if you take one extreme, let's say you have take a theme park, haunted house, you go in a car, strapped down, and you're forced to go through on a journey which lasts exactly 103 seconds or whatever it is. And at every point in that journey, a ghost will pop out. So that's like clockwork, essentially. So that's like, but even in that, you still have this a strange thing, because you would think that you have the least possible agency in that, but still people like close their eyes, they scream, there's a push and pull against how much control there is.
And I guess it sort of reveals in a way that one of the themes you're really talking about through the show is freedom and degrees of it, and what freedoms the subjects have and what freedoms I guess we as humans have. Maybe you could talk a bit more about that, because it seems like quite an important part of the work.
Thanks. And definitely the idea of freedom and control, this very important, I think, personal and political question is really embedded in there. I remember reading things in, I guess, in the open source software movement, right? Because the open source software movement talks about the idea of free, I mean, very much from a more capitalist point of view. So in one of the analogies I use is that in English, there's not many words for free. There's free and freedom, but in Latin, there's liber, which is like free, political freedom, I guess personal freedom, and gratis, which is free, no price paid. And talk about Nox. So in the video game Nox, you have a limited amount of what's called Nox coin that you can use to heal the car. So you have like a fixed budget. But I guess the irony is there that you have a set financialized amount in order to give psychological freedom to the car. So in a lot of dystopian, largely science fiction in the 20th century, it really is what is the price of freedom on the one hand, and the other, which is, I guess, maybe more of this Aldous Huxley way, is if you feel free, is that enough, right? Is it the belief that you are free enough? Is that preferable to true freedom? And I think that's a really interesting question, especially in, kind of algorithmic age, and especially for these beings, these kind of AI characters who, of course, in my world, those are very often avatars for the human condition. And what is the preferred level of freedom in relation to control that you can have?
And you've shown some of the work in Berlin before, and I wonder if the context of Germany and the context of Singapore represent different paradigms of freedom in sort of social terms.
Absolutely. I mean, even take the symbol of the car, right? Which I guess is pretty much I'm going to generalize, but is the paradigm of a technical object that embodies freedom, freedom of mobility, freedom of individual mobility. Of course, like with the advent of the train, of the steam engine, you had speed as mobility, but with the advent of the private car, that's really the thing that says you can be free to go wherever on your own terms. And that's, the genesis of the road movie in Hollywood very much. But in Germany, of course, in Los Angeles, where Nox was also shown, and in Singapore, the car as a cultural object, the very same thing, carries completely different weight. In Singapore, a car is a prestige object, a prestige possession, really. In Germany, it's a symbol of, revitalized German economy. And in LA, it's a kind of necessity. The whole city is literally built on highways as this ideology. So because unlike the earlier work, the car was kind of the symbol that throughout this smart city project, I feel it's something that's easily graspable, but completely elusive at the same time.
I think it's interesting you talked about the sort of freeways in LA, because underneath it, perhaps there's a sort of Rainer Banham, this sort of architectural critic, who talks about how LA is governed by its freeways, including when you come to your domestic bit of the city. Because he talks about how the off-ramp of the freeway is when you start applying your makeup, because you're about to enter public space, having been in a private space on the freeway. But I wonder how this idea of smart cities and how we interact with these spaces is developed through the work, because it seems to underlie it rather than be particularly present in Nox, for instance.
Yeah, so the city in these works is more this I mean, it's very present, but it's really this ambient presence, right? So I think there's sometimes an idea in filmmaking sometimes that, you know, the main character of the film is the city. You know, sometimes people say this about, I don't know, like particularly atmospheric films, like for example, like Wong Kar-wai, you know, Hong Kong is the main character in the city and so on. I wanted to create a sense that the city is the backdrop, it's the atmosphere, but it's also the governing logic of everything. So in terms of like the ambient presence, right? So very often in science fiction, you'll have a corporation that's behind everything. In the Alien franchise, it's the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. In Blade Runner, it's the Tyrell Corporation, and so on. And Terminator, Cyberdyne. So in a sense, like in my work, Farsight is that umbrella organization, and Farsight and the smart city are kind of like go hand in hand. It made me also think a lot about, you know, early planned cities in the 19th century where you'd have like, what is it? The Cadbury's chocolate factory town, Bourneville in the UK, and towns built around one industry, which, you know, obviously completely persists today. But in a sense, the city is self-aware, but you never hear from it. You know, it's really this ambient presence that's all over.
But I think calling the corporation Farsight as well brings to mind surveillance, which is also a condition of smart cities and cities in general. I wonder, and there's also very much a present in the show. So when you're playing the games, you're conscious that you're not playing them in your bedroom at home on your own. You're playing them in public, and people are looking at you as much as they're looking at the videos and the other work. And there is this feeling of being looked at and not just doing the looking through the show. And I wonder if that's something you wanted to sort of subject people to.
The awareness of being seen or being immersed is obviously, you know, one of the central questions of surveillance, right? So in in the original idea for Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, it's not that you're being watched all the time, but you don't know when you are being watched and when you're not. And it's actually that uncertainty that creates the anxiety of surveillance. I suppose in my work, what I hope to do is that awareness or that self-awareness really ebbs and flows. So sometimes you are aware that you might be watched, or you're being aware that another character is being watched or kind of suffering for being watched. And that maybe might create a sense of like empathy, or at least awareness at other times.
And I want to maybe turn to the question of artificial intelligence, which also underlies the show. And I think to some degree, you humanize it through the characters of the cars and through the therapy process even. This idea of anthropomorphizing something that's artificial and to some degree unknown, is that about making people feel comfortable with it or uncomfortable with it?
The intention is so much like comfort or discomfort. I think when I try and speculate on certain things, it happens as a thought experiment. So even though there's a huge amount of, I guess, realism and creative license involved or imagination, it's not to explicitly create comfort or discomfort like it might be in a horror movie, like let's say. It's really fulfilling just my thought experiment of how conditions might be if things were otherwise. But one thing I actually want to mention as well, that also goes, let's say, into Farsight, this idea, because the idea for Farsight coexisted with the idea of Geomancer as a surveillance satellite. So when I was like researching AI and big data and supercomputing back in 2016, 2017, it was very interesting that the idea of prediction is the holy grail in a sense of technology, but also not just technology, but mysticism as well. Fortune telling, weather prediction, geomancy, which is why it's called Geomancer, is, I think, the confluence of like certainty about the future and knowledge and computing. So Farsight, of course, could be seen as a surveillance company, but also Farsight is, in the mystical sense, in this geomancy sense, it's prediction of what the future might bring. And I think that is also something that's used a lot in, industries that specialize in future prediction, like trend forecasting or prediction, or any kind of like the next quarterly report and so on. So I thought this idea of desiring to predict the future is a confluence of so many different ambitions.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because one of the things I do when I'm in Singapore is see my geomancer. And he doesn't really predict the future so much as tell me how I can prevent the future from happening. So normally the future is entirely negative for love, finance, everything, unless I purchase a vast amount of crystals and put them in exact positions at home, right? So for me, the geomancy is really about preventing or changing the future, not knowing it, but knowing it and then altering it. And I wonder if that's the sort of sense you have about what we might take away from experiencing the works. Is this also like, we could be more caring and then the world be in a different shape? I guess that's one of the messages through the work.
In different narratives, the idea of having a message obviously shifts completely. If you take on the one hand, cautionary tales, like there was an ancient person who did this and something bad happened and therefore don't do that. There's that side of the cautionary tale, which can be, very, very common in I guess Aesop's fables and things like that. It's don't do this, otherwise that. In my work, back to this idea of it being essentially an extended thought experiment, the message I have is multi-layered, I suppose. And even for me, because it comes out of a reflection of so many different trends and personal interests, compassionate interests, cynical interests sometimes when it's to do with farsight, it really is, I guess, not as straightforward as the message. Of course, the message might be, think about reality more, but that's impossible, I feel, for me to completely specify or control what people are going to take away. So what I've learned is that if I'm creating this world with many different entry points, everyone will have a different journey through the work, in a sense, in a different way than if it were a painting, let's say, because there's the aspect of a completely individual journey through it. And because of that, I feel what I've learned is that people bring in their own memories and sometimes their own biases or familiarity or loves and hates and fears into the work as well. So the message at the end is much more complicated than anything I could try and specify.
Yeah. But I guess in some ways there might be a basic message that would be a sort of Marxist one about exploitation of workforces and laborers. Is that something you see there?
Definitely. I mean, a lot of the content is highly spiritual, but a lot of it is highly about work and labor. So one of the paradoxes I'm interested in, again, is super intelligence, but super overworked. And it just seems that talking about, the idea of exploitation in both physical and mental labor, it would be a logical thing that is the unique point about AI. It is something that could, in theory, work forever endlessly with no rights and so on. And that, I guess, makes me draw parallels to many human workers who have a lack of those, agency or labor or legal protection and so on. So sometimes I think I'm an artist working in visual arts. At the same time, I'm a content creator in a elevated industry. And so I enjoy that ambiguity, really, because sometimes I enjoy the fact of being essentially like a anonymous musician and creator. And at other times I have, solo exhibitions where my practice is really at the forefront. So as someone who grew up liking, everyday culture, it's important for me to have different entry points, not just in terms of media, but in terms of, people sometimes see my work screened in a in a bar or a club or something like that. And I enjoy that different forms of distribution and engagement.
To come back for a moment to the question of AI, I guess you've kind of been dancing around what it is. And I think that's one of the questions that the exhibition and your work in general throws up, because, it oscillates between a tool and an entity or a being. Do you have a particular position on that?
My position, if you can call it that, is AI is a very unique thing, because unlike many other technologies that are very influential, it was speculated on, it was imagined, it was branded decades before it became a technological feasibility. Of course, this was the same with space travel or like horseless carriages and so on. But the difference is that it's a technology of thought rather than of just mechanical power. And because AI was imagined by so many different angles long before its existence, I think this made this kind of branching impossibility of defining exactly what it was. I think AI was the term was coined by, I forget who exactly, it was given a name in 1956 at a conference, so being a branded technology that was later made feasible and has become part of everyday life in completely unexpected ways is, I think, one of the examples of second order consequences, right? So it was branded in a certain way. People thought that it would be related to like cybernetics and military and things like that. There, of course it was, but in terms of everyday life, it's large language models, it's ChatGPT, it's like very mundane. That's the thing. It's nothing, nothing in terms of just the corporate or governmental power, but it's really individuals, consumers who use it every day. And I think that that's a really unexpected thing. And that's why with Knox and Guanyin, it's about this smart city, but it's also about this little chatbot that talks to all the AIs, which with your own personalities.
And how do you, as an artist and creative, how do you feel threatened by AI? Or is it something you embrace?
The more I work with AI as a subject, so because AI has been the subject, the main character, but not necessarily the tool for the last 10 years, I feel much like any subject that an artist might deal with, whether it's, rainforests or something, you gain a deeper understanding of the subject, and actually the subject kind of becomes part of you in a certain way. And what I've learned is the more I work with not even AI, but like algorithmic processes or digital software, the more I understand that there's a general human bias, because I want to feel special. I want to feel original, creative, like I've got special, unique thoughts. But if I actually break it down, a lot of my process is methodical. I think, okay, there's a corporation, they have a car, then they have a chatbot, then they have an environment. So I begin to question, like, to what extent my thinking is, it's branching, but it also has its own logic, its algorithmic thinking to it. There's a big element of intuition and invention and imagination, but it's not the threat that it's interesting for me. It's thinking, what is it I do that is unique in that? So I think the threat would come through the idea of physical and mental labor, but also as an artist, you reach a certain point where you have to decide how much of my practice, how much of the work am I making? And sometimes some people outsource it to other people, some people outsource it to AI, and some people end up completely overworked. And generally, it's a combination of those. So it's a complicated thought process because I've been working on it for so long, I think.
I guess for me, watching the work, one of the suggestions is that in the sense that the cars have a sort of personhood, that where that personhood is revealed is in their failure, like when they fail to do something, just as much as I know a lot of writers right now who are using like sentences with no verbs, things that an AI wouldn't do, or very baroque pieces of grammar in order to prove that they're human, to sort of fail according to the rules. And the same with some visual imagery authors. And I wonder if part of what you're talking about is that sense of failure as being the sort of condition of personhood and a condition of having a practice, both in a Buddhist sense, a medical sense, or even just a human sense.
No, completely. I mean, I think quite a lot about, I describe this as artist films, artist video games, or artist practice, but what is it that makes this different to what a commercial game company would do, or what like a Hollywood studio would do, or what an architect would do, actually? And when I was kind of making the long and uneasy transition between thinking about experimental architecture and art, I actually thought a huge difference is in design, or in essentially hired work. You have a brief, right? You have a brief that you have to respond to. You have to respond very clearly to a set of criteria that you inherit from, your client or something.
Yeah.
And just to generalize, in a very simple way, I realize to be an artist, you don't have a brief, and you kind of need to invent that all the time. And in relation to, let's say, writers who they're reinventing the brief of what it means to be a writer, if, AI can write perfect Shakespearean sonnets ad infinitum, then they might have to take on certain constraints of like writing an anti-poem or writing without the letter A, E, I, or U or something. And I think particularly in text-based forms of practice, it's incredibly challenging to create, a certain style or uniqueness in what the writer is doing. And this has kind of been the case forever. I guess with what I'm doing, because it's a confluence of different art forms, there's writing, there's visual, there's spatial, there's sound and video and games. For me, the unique thing is, that like poetic imagination, not poetry necessarily, but like dealing with those different art forms in a holistic way. And just to your point, that failure is what makes the cause unique. I mean, that's absolutely it, because it's the transgressions of the individual against the system that individuality is expressed. So in the game, for example, there are 4 cars. Vanguard is a former police car with anger management issues. This is Enigma, a self-driving car with depression, basically, because they can't talk to anyone. So no matter, I guess this is the message, is no matter how hard an external system attempts to exert control, some individuals will always try and resist that.
And I guess I wanted to ask as well, like how works like this would begin. Would it begin with a narrative, or would it begin with a problem you want to solve or work through, or something visual or something musical?
It's a great point. I was just quickly glancing through the ArtReview article, and the first line of that is a quote from Black Cloud, which is, can you describe the problem that you're having today? Is kind of a therapist question. And that is also how ambiguous my starting point is. It might not be a problem, but it's like, what's the kind of friction with reality that I'm interested in? In the case of Nox, sometimes it emerges from a site, like an opportunity. Somebody invited me to do a project in a former car park. That project didn't happen, but it got me thinking, like, how would my world fit this very mundane structure? So I was like, a training center for self-driving cars. And these ideas that incubate for many years later turn into projects, and 5 years later the subconscious is at work, and then it turns out like that. Sometimes it's much more deliberate and planned. With Geomancer, the film from 2017, I thought, I've been making these site-specific projects, and because I live in Europe, most of the sites have been European. So finally I'm like, maybe I'll choose Singapore as the site where that happens. And so that would be a bit more deliberately made against what I would normally do.
And when you were showing the sort of trajectory of your work, you showed the series in a kind of graph, very much like a sort of linear business plan. Are you thinking about that, how one work flows into the next or leads to the next, or thinking as chapters in an overarching narrative?
The original timeline had like 50 different points in it, and someone suggested to me you should really simplify that for presentations. So now it seems, again, looking back, it seems like it all makes sense. But actually, reality as an artist is that many projects are kind of opportunistic. It's based on being invited to do something at a certain place. But over time, I kind of put these points together, and I realized that these series have emerged. But having done these three kind of like bodies of work, I'm actually thinking of what, really what's coming next. The AI question is really important. And I think, what is it unique that I'm doing? So I'm thinking through how really the next phase of my practice evolves. And well, I don't know yet.
Where have you got to with that? Still a question.
Oh, it's still a question, yeah.
Yeah. But I think what was really interesting, as I said earlier about the talk, was the way you provide this sort of presentation of logical progression, but also the themes about what the work might be about are just manifold and go off in different directions. And I think that's sort of one of the really interesting things that we don't always think about when we think about games or linear video works. And I wonder if that's something you're interested in, this sort of, I guess, the grey areas and the sort of fuzz and distortion.
Completely. I think, what is it? Ekphrasis, right?
Yeah.
Ekphrasis is an idea that an art form is trying to convey something that is only present in another art form, something like that. It's like a poem written for a Greek urn or something like that. So there's the famous video game designer Hideo Kojima, who's famously like obsessed with games as a cinematic practice, and this is really something that I'm kind of drawn to. So if I have a video game that's actually like an architectural practice, or filmmaking that's actually a game practice, everything is blurring in between each other in terms of where the boundaries are. I guess one of the challenges is always making sense in a way that conveys things to an audience, because a lot of my work is so narratively rich. I find that if I just describe the narratives, it's going to take half an hour to say, oh, there's this character that went into that, and it becomes a bit of a fan fiction type of thing where it's not connecting. I'm just talking about, different characters that are made up. And I feel that doesn't necessarily convey the main messages, just talking about the content.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting the way you describe your practices of bits of architecture, bits of film, bits of music, bits of art. Is there something in you that sort of wants to resist the fate of the cars, being pigeonholed as a certain type? When you describe the cars, they're types. There's the police car. Do you want to resist that as an artist, I guess?
To be honest, the switching between different topics and media is more an intuitive process, I suppose. In contrast, let's say there are different kinds of artists who consciously be like, I don't want to be pigeonholed as, this kind of musician who only writes like sad songs. I want to, transgress the expectations. Because of the opportunities I get, thankfully, I get opportunities to start at many different starting points. So in some areas, some fields, I'm known as a filmmaker, and then I'm invited to give, filmmaking kind of panels, or talk about my work in relation to games, or my work in relation to experimental music or geopolitical things. So that multifacetedness, I feel, emerges organically, and it's less deliberately trying to reposition myself, because I feel you're never really in control of that.
Yeah. But I guess I asked it because you trained in a discipline, architecture. and then seem to have somehow wanted to distort that discipline a bit and use it in different ways with different outcomes that aren't loft extensions.
Right. So in studying architecture, it's theoretically it's about space and utopia and big ideas, but in practice it's very often about property ownership, square foot, outcomes and things that have very specific value in terms of the real world because it's to do with real space. And on the other hand, it's really about pure thought experiments of how the world could be. And it's that tradition of architecture that I do feel I'm continuing. And I wouldn't even say architecture, it's more spatial imagination, I suppose.
I think at this point we can open it up to any questions from the audience. If you raise your hand, there'll be a microphone coming, so if you can wait till the microphone comes, that would be great.
Hi, thank you. When you talk about artificial intelligence, or when you hear people discuss about artificial consciousness, do you think that we know they are discussing a technical kind of engineering kind of problem or philosophical kind of problem where they are talking about the meaning of life? Or do you think it's about like power and control because of the economic and political associations to this? And also, what you hope that you must take away from your exhibition?
Thanks for the question. So, if I understand this correctly, the first is when I hear discussions about artificial intelligence or artificial consciousness, what do I feel is at the root of it? Is it like a technical thing or is it a cultural thing? In discussions, I think particularly the question of intelligence or consciousness, like neuroscientists and cognitive behaviorists don't agree on what constitutes either intelligence or consciousness, because I don't mean to get away from this by saying it's impossible to know, but I'm interested in this idea of like intelligence or consciousness in line with I suppose like a Turing test kind of definition, where consciousness is something that when you're trying to inquire if something else has consciousness or intelligence, it's actually a consequence of the test that you apply, because you will never know fundamentally. I mean, like disregard artificial intelligence, just think talking to a cat, right? Or does a cat have intelligence? Does a cat have consciousness? We imagine it does because it's an animal, but does certainty around that exist? It's like, no. So I think a similar thing about AI or consciousness. It's certainty about that is a function of the test that you're applying to determine those things. And the second question, what do I hope people will take away from this show, and maybe from my practice as well, is most fundamentally an awareness that we are intimately involved in the formation of the future, and our attitude towards that formation is an incredibly important thing. I think today there's a strong sense of individual, like, let's say, lack of agency or powerlessness in different political situations or climate change, let's say, or what's happening around the world. And I'm using these non-human characters as avatars of beings that are really going to feel this first, so to speak. And by making, I hope, like a connection between the audience and these new characters, then you can come away with a sense of how important it is to embody like compassion and empathy towards the future. Yeah. Thanks.
Are there other questions? There's one there and then one there.
Thanks. So, related, I'll ask the question separately. You've dealt with the potential needs and desires of automated vehicles, for example. Mention has been made of rights, but unless I missed it, that hasn't been discussed. Have you dug into whether legal personhood makes sense for autonomous machines or fleets of autonomous machines, which behave differently to multiple humans driving cars? Is that an area that you've explored?
Yes, actually. The sequel to Nox is called Empty Rider, and it looks at the question of non-human personhood and the legal implications of, self-driving cars. Basically, Empty Rider is about, it's a fictional short film, but it's about a self-driving car who's accused of the attempted murder of their creator. And in this, I was looking at essentially different frameworks of legal responsibility. So in self-driving car, legal questions around self-driving cars, it's not just about the training and the data, but also, essentially who's responsible should an accident happen. So in Empty Rider, I was looking both into the case where the first fatality involving a self-driving car on autopilot happened between an Uber car, an Uber self-driving system inside a Volvo car in Arizona. And, in these incidents, kind of like air traffic, commercial air incidents, they always try and pin the blame on the individual human as opposed to the company. And that's a liability, it's an insurance thing, really. In Empty Rider, I make the argument that the car gets electronic personhood, but the reason they get electronic personhood is not because of a kind of humanist belief in mercy or innocence. It's really just to ascribe the blame to the car. So that was very much centered around the idea of like legality of AI.
Thank you.
I think there was a question on this side of the room as well. Did I get that?
Hi. Firstly, thank you so much for this incredibly insightful talk. In your work, and particularly for Nox, right, it seems to be quite a deliberate absence of humans. And I think it's so interesting because it contrasts quite starkly with your classic sci-fi like Blade Runner, where an extremely densely overpopulated kind of cities is kind of at the center of the context. So I'm just kind of curious as to, if there's any intention behind that. Thank you.
Thanks. I suppose in the worlds that I'm making, I'm really interested in this idea of one of the ideas besides having multifacetedness is also extreme contrasts, for example. So it's great that a lot of our imagination around, the future is really driven by not even human-centric, like star-centric cinema, because in the kind of Hollywood cinematic idiom, you identify with the main characters, and through their eyes you witness the world, and you kind of feel because you see the micro expressions on their face, and you kind of, the mirror neurons in our body make us feel a similar way in that. I'm really interested in the magic that could happen if you have those very same feelings, or if you have an emotional connection with things or pixels on screen that there was never any human in the loop, let's say. Film theorists have written extensively about, the aura of Hollywood star. And some of those arguments say that, the quintessential thing about empathy-driven cinema that drives even Blade Runner and so on is the close-up. It's the extreme close-up where the face stretches across the whole screen, and every micro-expression is really kind of felt and made real. And it's that like expansion of the face that constitutes like what the magic is of seeing, I don't know, Harrison Ford or, whoever else expressing those things. In Nox, you don't get that, but you get this extreme close-up of a horse, and you can tell that it's a digitally rendered horse. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I do believe it's quite a magical thing where you see this animated thing, and if you feel a fraction of connection, that is, for me, a stand-in with, how you might relate to technology or AI a different way.
And maybe I can ask, as a way of sort of ending. Is the future generally something you're kind of positive and optimistic about, or mixed or pessimistic?
There's the things I am optimistic about and the things I'm pessimistic about, I feel balance out into like a net zero, let's wait and see. I feel because the message, if we might say that, going back to the idea of utopian and dystopian, let's say optimistic or pessimistic outcomes, is in my work, I'm interested in the nature, not to sound too grand about it, but like the nature of reality, which is neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I think optimism and pessimism also imply a certain idea about what the future is in a kind of as time proceeds. My practice, I feel, is more to do with this. Even though it may be set in the future or not, it's always reflecting the present. And even if I look at geomancer or works that are made 10 years ago, we see them now and they're still about the present. So for me, it really is that kind of worldview, in a sense, that, and shared by both mystics and physicists, that there is, there's no past and there is no future. That is just a perpetual present. And even if I'm making work that's set in the future, at some point it will be in the chronological past. In the year 2066, 2065 will be a distant memory. And so in this mindset of the perpetual present, how can we come to understand like how to shape things in a slightly different way beyond optimism and pessimism? Because I feel those are more slightly more ideological frameworks, and my artwork is not an ideological framework.
But it could be read.
That way.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lawrence.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much.
Before we close the program today, please allow us to share a round of thank yous. First of all, Lawrence, for being so generous in fronting the program, but also sharing your universe with us. Mark, Glenn, and ArtReview, thank you for collaborating with us on this opening moment, and Mark, really, for moderating this really thoughtful and expansive conversation with Lawrence, which we really appreciate. Would love to share a thank you with Honor as well, who contributed opening remarks. And as always, our opening programs are really collective efforts. And please allow me to just share a quick round of thanks with the production team. So we have our technical operators, Keys and Fadila. We have our documentation team, Conclave, as well as Jasper, and also my exceptional public programs colleagues. So most of all, Doreen, and also Charmaine, whom you've met at the front of house. And we loved having all of you in the audience tonight. And we appreciate this because Singapore Art Week is so busy. So we really appreciate having your presence here today. And the bar will remain open until 9 p.m. when the museum closes. So we hope you take time to mingle. We love having the family members here as well. So please come up and talk to the artists if you have time. And maybe see Knox when it's on show at the museum at your own pace. Thank you for being part of the ArtScience Museum story. Have a good night and enjoy the rest of Singapore Art Week.